Hello and welcome to the 21st chapter of the course. In this chapter, we will do a PKO quiz. I have for you a few different questions about various stages of the tournament and different scenarios where I would like you to try and come up with the answer. Of course, nailing the exact ranges in every spot is impossible. What you should try to do is grasp the concept behind the decision and try to go for the correct direction. Figuring out every exact combo, it should not be your aim. The spots will be from two different tournaments. Both are $215 buys with $100 into the regular prize pool and $100 into the bounty prize pool. Also, the starting stacks are going to be different. One has a 25k starting stack, the other has a 5k starting stack. All of the details about the tournament, such as the starting stack, the stage, and the bounties, can be seen in the hand history pasted. On the left side, you will have the hand history, and on the right side, you will have a picture of the spot to better visualize it. So, for example, in the first spot, which is a generic one in the generic spot category, we can see that we are well in the money with 28 players left and 5k starting stack. Well in the money means that the bubble didn't just break, we are fairly deep into the tournament. And if we assume a 33% opening range, how wide should Sergio jam and what should our calling range look like? There is no trick question. Sometimes the wording is a bit different, but there's nothing surprising, just fairly straightforward questions. The bounty, for example, Sergio, you can see has 1,131, and the starting bounty is 100. We can see this here in the buy, where it is 100 plus 100. So $100 starting bounty, he has 11 starting bounties. A starting stack is 5k, as mentioned here. And we know that at this stage, a starting bounty is worth how much? That's for you to decide. So at this point, feel free to pause the video and think about the answer to each question. And once you have answered all of them, or as many as you like, then continue from here so that we can look at the answers together. I'm just going to wait a few seconds. And now I will jump into the answers. So as I said, in the first spot, we are facing a jam from Sergio. Now, as Sergio, when you have a fairly large bounty, 11 starting bounties, which at this point, a starting bounty would be about 40% of a starting stack, so around 2k. He has 11, so around 22k. You can see the big blind is 7,000. It is written here. So he has about 3 big blinds worth of bounty. However, he does cover a bunch of players behind. He covers 1, 2, 3 of them. So this allows him to jam somewhat wide, along with our wide opening range. So, as I said, we open about 33%, and his jamming range should be like this. So 6s through kings, ace jack off, ace queen off, ace king off, and then king queen suited, some king jack suited, and suited aces, ace 10 through ace king suited. Again, the reason he can jam this wide is that he covers a bunch of stacks behind, and then also our opening range is very wide itself. Now, against this range, we get to call fairly wide. So good suited hands and every single pocket pair. Again, pocket pairs perform really well against callings because his range doesn't contain that many pocket pairs. But we're folding hands like ace 10 off, we're folding like ace 7 suited, we're folding like queen 9 suited, jack 9 suited, and so on. Okay, next spot, we have this one. So it's well in the money, 40 players left. Again, 5k starting stack, it's the same tournament. So it falls to us on the bottom, and we have two questions here. So first, how wide should we be jamming when it falls to us? And second, if the cutoff raised instead a 30% open range, how wide would we be able to jam against cutoffs open? So for the first question, which is how wide should we be jamming, the first thing we need to do is look at our opponent's bounties. The small blind, the shorter stack, Hervedosa, has about 6 starting bounties, which at this point is around 12k or 3 big blinds. The big blind, however, only has 1.5 starting bounties, which at this point is worth less than one big blind. So because the big blind's bounty is so small, we actually don't get to jam that wide. 8-9 suited does make it into the jamming range. But if you look at this, our jamming range is very, very limited. We jam offsuit ace-x, these kind of middling suited hands, lowest pocket pairs, and lowest suited aces. We want to be raising very wide, and a lot of these hands you can induce. But yeah, the problem is that, as I said, big blind bounty is just not that large. In practice, we can make a case that maybe the big blind will not be calling enough. Maybe he doesn't call king-jack for 21 big blinds. Maybe he doesn't call like 3 ace-5 off. Same goes for the small blind. And the tighter we think they call, the more we can jam. Now, for the second part of the question, which was, what if the cutoff raised a 30% frequency instead? How would we be able to rejam against that? So we need to look for cutoff's bounty first. Cutoff or Lorient neck has 6 starting bounties, which is worth, again, around 3 big blinds. So it's not that much. Also, 30% is a fairly tight range. So in this case, we just don't really get to jam that much. Against his open, we get to play like this. So we jam around 12%, pocket pairs, strong suited stuff, low suited aces, ace-jack off, ace-queen off, ace-king off. But 9-8 suited doesn't make it into the jamming range. We get to call fairly wide as well. With suited connectors, as you can see, we're doing a lot of calling, as well as offsuit broadways. The reason we can't jam more is that, first, both the blinds will end up calling reasonably wide, and then the cutoff can raise call us fairly wide as well. So yeah, we can't be jamming too wide here. Next up, we have this spot. So we are well in the money again. 60 players left, 5K starting slot, same tournament. If we assume that we open a 39% range from the cutoff, how wide should the big blind be jamming here? Then how wide do we get to call against his jamming range? Then we also have 2 more questions, which is, how would these ranges look like if the stacks were reversed? If instead of us slightly covering the big blind, as we see now, the big blind slightly covered us. Let's have a look. So we open around 39.6, and the big blind gets to play like this now that he's covered. So middling pocket pairs, ace deuce off, ace-jack off, ace-queen off, ace-king off. Ace deuce off is one of the better jams because the deuce doesn't block our ace folding range. We saw similar spots before as well, with ace deuce off being like the primary 3-bet or jam. But overall, we can see not too much jamming and inducing jacks plus, ace-x suited, ace-queen suited, ace-king suited. After the big blind jams, we get to call 6s, ace-10 off, ace-10 suited, and these kind of hands are break even. Even though the big blind's bounty isn't worth nothing, it is 6 starting bounties, so around 4 big blinds, right? 2,000 times 6, 12, a bit more, so like 12.5 big blinds, 12,500, so 4 big blinds. I misspoke. It's not worth nothing, but it's not worth much either. And then also the problem is that we basically risk our entire stack here. So even though we cover, we have to call fairly tight. Now, what if, as said, the stacks were reversed and the big blind was covering us by a little bit? Our bounty is 4 starting, so quite a bit smaller, worth about 8,000 or like a bit less than 3 big blinds. And here, the big blind would be jamming something like this. So not too much more. If we look at the range, so it was 5.5 and now it is 6.2. So some very slight differences, a bit wider of a jamming range, but still not jamming much. The problem here is that, yes, he covers us, but what we explain from our point of view now is true from his. Even though he covers, he risks the entire stack here. If he had like 100 big blinds, he would be able to jam wider. Against this jamming range, we end up calling pretty much the same range as before. This was the range before, 8.7, now it's 9.2, so even slightly wider, even though we don't cover. Why? Well, before we had the incentive of covering, but his jamming range was fairly tight. Now we don't cover anymore, but his jamming range is wider. So because his range is wider, we end up calling slightly wider than before as well. And this is a fairly reoccurring concept in PSKOs where when we cover but the bounties are small, we still get to call fairly tight. But often when it's the other way around, we end up calling wider because our opponents are jamming wider on us when they cover us. The next spot that we have is this one. So this goes back in the tournament to the very beginning. We can see the big line is 140 and starting stack is 5K. So a starting bounty here would be worth 1/4 of the starting stack. So 1,250 or about 9 big blinds. And the first question we have is how wide should the 10 big blind short stack jam and how wide should we call? So he's jamming 10 big blinds and his bounty is worth 9. So he has close to 0 fold equity. Because of that, he actually needs to be somewhat tight. If we look at his range here, you can see that he can jam the low pocket pairs, which are jams in normal non-PSKO tournaments, and he can jam like suited 9x, he can jam suited 8x, or this low offsuit ace-x. Basically, this is a bit of a tighter range compared to a normal non-PSKO tournament because of his reduced fold equity. In these spots, we need to be jamming a fairly strong range because we need to have hands that do well against all of the calls. So jamming 10-9 suited just isn't going to be good because we don't fold out anything better. We get called by Jack 10 off, we get called by like Ace Deuce off, so many hands that are better than 10-9. So we want to be high card heavy and just strong hands that win at showdown. Against this jam, even though we're getting insane odds, we actually cannot be calling any two from the big blinds. You can see the absolute garbage we end up folding. Of course, we're calling super wide because it's 10 big blind jams with a 9 big blind bounty, but it's not any two. The second part of this question was, okay, so Limao jams, and then the button rejams. The button covers both small and the big blind. And the question is, how wide can we call after the button jams? Why can we call from the big blind when the button rejams? So 10 big blind jam, 39 big blind jam, how wide are we calling? And here we need to be calling very, very wide because we don't really care about him. We basically need to beat the button. That's our main concern because he jams 10, his bounty is worth 9. It like nullifies each other. So the only thing we care about is beating the button. And the button himself will be jamming very, very wide because he covers both of us. So if we look at this, actually, I already have this open. So he jumps, and then the button is playing like this. So mostly we're jamming because the bounty is just worth so much. And we can see jamming 29%. So against the 29% jamming range, from the big blind, we are calling 18%. So we are calling pocket threes, we're calling like ace-8 off, suited broadways, king-jack off, even king-9 suited is basically break-even. And for me, the way I would approach this is what I described. We basically care about beating the button. That's it. Then the final part of this question. So forget about the button. We have the short stack jamming for 10 big blinds. And it falls to the small blind, who has 25 big blinds and is covered by us. How wide can he jam? And then how wide should we call his jam? Just so clear, we have Limao jamming and Han rejamming, and how wide should he jam and how wide should we call? This is a spot where the ranges are perhaps surprisingly wide. Because there's only one player left behind for Han, he actually gets to jam a ridiculously wide range, and we get to call a ridiculously wide range as well. So he's supposed to be jamming 34% of hands, roughly. We can see any pair, like king-9 off, suited kings, 10-8 suited, any ace, and 0 calls for him. And us in the big blind, now there are 9 big blinds bounty dead from him, and 9 big blinds bounties dead from the small blind. So we end up calling 45%. You can see we're calling anything like suited connected, any suited king, any suited queen, any ace, king 6 plus. Just a very, very wide range because of how much that money is in the pot. I think it is very important to keep in mind that PSKOs involve a lot of all-ins, a lot of gambling, and this pot just shows that very clearly. We have a short stack jamming, and then small blind has to get it in with a third of his range, and big blind has to overcall with half his range. So these spots will occur fairly often. Then the next four spots will be about bubble ICM. Now we're also switching tournament. The other one, the tournament we'll look into now, is again a 215 buy-in, as I said. But now the difference is that the starting stack is 25k. So not 5k, 25k. Here we are 140 players left with 110 players paid. We are kind of close to the money, but we're not right there yet. So risk premiums are extremely high. What we're looking for here is how does under the gun get to play his range? So how wide can he raise and how wide can he be jamming? Then when he jumps, how wide can we rejump from the cutoff? And if he raises, how wide can the button call from the button? So let's take them one thing at a time. First, under the gun. We need to be checking his bounty. He has one started bounty. At this point, it would be worth about maybe 8k chips out of 25, maybe 9k. So roughly around 3 big blinds. Not too much, but still a significant portion of his stack. So he has to be fairly tight here. Like this. So jamming about 4.5%, which will be lowest pocket pairs like 6s through 9s, good suited broadways, ace jack off, ace queen off, and the rest go into them in raising range. Overall, it's a VPAP total of 14%. So fairly tight. Second thing is how do we respond when he jumps? And what we need to do here is look at our bounty. We have over 3 starting bounties, which at this point is about 27k, maybe a bit more, so a bit over 9 blinds. So we will be rejamming 29 with a bounty of about 9. So a very healthy portion of our stack. Then the next thing we need to consider is the stacks behind, mainly with the button. So the button here has a very large stack size, which means can actually overcall our rejam with a fairly wide range himself. The dead money from the 2 bounties are going to be pretty high. It's going to be about 12, 13 big blinds in the middle. And his risk premium is very much down in the negative, because even if he loses here, he's still going to be the big stack of the table and definitely going to make the money. Well, almost definitely anyway. It's a tournament, so you never know. So these 2 factors lead to us rejamming a fairly tight range. Here we are, cutoff. I clicked the wrong thing. So we're rejamming basically, well, I mean, whether we call or rejam, it's the same. We're never calling and then folding. So we basically go with H plus, ace queen off, ace jack suited. So we're folding 7s, we're folding ace jack off, we're folding king queen suited against the jam from under the gun. And again, the problem is that the button would be able to call us very wide if we jammed more. Then finally, we want to look at what would the button, the big stack, be calling when under the gun min raises. And in this kind of spots, the button can actually be calling very wide, even though the opening range is super tight. The button ends up calling many suited connected hands, and this can be supported by the top of his range. You can see calling aces, kings, full frequency, even calling some ace king suited, ace queen suited, ace jack suited, and so on. As we've said, in PKOs, the big stacks just call a lot. They don't really 3-bet that much. You can see the 3-bets are very, very limited. So yeah, calling suited connectors, even though it's just a 13 big blind tight opening range. The next bubble spot that we have is from the same tournament. So now it's 120 players left with 110 paid. So now we are much, much closer to the money bubble. We assume it falls to cutoff, Mahairong, who has 22 big blinds. And our question is, how wide does he get to raise and how wide does he get to jam? His bounty is something we need to consider to begin the hand, is 4 starting bounties. So 4 times 9, 36k, or 9 big blinds. So his bounty is worth 9 big blinds and he has a 22 big blind stack. So very significant portion of his stack. What this means is that he actually has to play very, very tight. If we look at this, he's only supposed to raise a 15% range. No jumps pretty much. And he's covered by two of the three people behind. We can see the small blind is the big stack, and big blind covers him by a bit, but still covers him. After he min raises, we have some very interesting mechanics from the range behind. First, the bottom, who is the 12.5 big blind stack, has to play extremely tight. You can see folding ace-jack, folding king-jack suited, pocket eights. And that's because the opening range is also ridiculously tight. Against the open, the small blind gets to call a lot, gets to jam a lot. We can see just a very, very wide kind of range. The bounty is worth a lot, and the small blind has a huge stack, so can basically gamble away. If the small blind folds, the big blind, though, is playing a very, very different kind of strategy. And this is something worth highlighting. Because the big blind stack is very similar to that of the cutoff, the big blind actually isn't very incentivized to get it in, because he will end up bubbling. We are super close to in the money, so the big blind has to be careful, especially against the very tight opening range. So even though the cutoff is opening of 19 big blind or 21 big blinds, 19 left, 21 starting, we can see the big blind is playing 0 jams. Induces 10s plus ace queen suited, ace king off, and has some blocker bluffs, but 0 jams, and calls hands like 9s, ace queen off, 8s, and so on. Definitely a good takeaway from here that against the very, very tight opening ranges, even though we cover when we are sort ourselves near the bubble, we need to be very careful. Now, the second part of this question asks, how should his range look like if instead of this being a PSKO, it was a normal vanilla tournament? How should Maherov be opening or jamming then? And the answer is, even though his risk premium would be higher, he actually gets to open more, because without the bounty, people behind aren't incentivized to get it in against him. So we can see now cutoff's opening range goes up to 19%. Was 15.6, now is 19. So these low suited aces are the main additions. In terms of risk premium, in the PSKO example, the cutoff has plus 11% of risk premium against the positions behind, 11.3. And in the normal non-PSKO tournament, the cutoff has, you can see, 16.4. So it's significantly higher, but because players behind just don't want to put more money in, the cutoff gets to raise more. So if we compare the small blind response, we can see there is way less jamming in the normal tournament. And the big blind is 3-betting way less as well. So this illustrates what we spoke about in the second chapter with the theory that in PSKO bubbles, when we are covered, we actually play tighter than a normal tournament because of our reduced fold equity. Next, we have this spot. It's the same tournament, 25k starting stack, and we are 130 left with 110 paid. So very close to the money bubble. Our question is, how wide should Shasha, the short stack, who has 9 big blinds jump, and how wide should we call from the big blind? Sasha has a starting bounty, which is worth, as we said, around 9k, so around close to 3 big blinds, a bit less than 3 big blinds, like 2.7. Not too much, but again, significant compared to a stack. This leads to him having a very low fold equity, so he has to play a very tight jamming range. If we look at this, he's jamming only 10%. So 5s plus, ace 10 plus, and suited aces, suited broadways. You can see folding king jack, folding jack 10 suited, queen 10 suited. These hands would be jams in non-PSKOs, but in the PSKO, we just don't fold out enough better hands. Against this kind of tight range, we end up calling deuces plus, ace 9 off, suited aces, and suited broadways, king jack off being break even. So ace 8 off would actually be a fold. Now, in practice, I would think people end up jamming a bit more. I don't think people have it in them to fold like queen 10 or jack 10 suited or fours with 9 big blinds. So I think the ace 8 call would be fine. But yeah, against tighter players, we need to be very careful and call very tight here. Next, we have this spot, which is back to the previous tournament with the 5k starting stack. It is 250 players left with 215 paid. So somewhat close to the money bubble, not quite there yet. So here we are, and we assume it falls to us on the bottle. The question is, how wide do we get to jam here in the bounty, and how wide would we jam in a non-PSKO tournament? King Deuce obviously not going to be jamming either one of them, but our actual hand doesn't matter. Our bounty is 1 starting, which is, it's a 5k starting stack here, so it's worth about 2k or 2.5 big blinds. Small blind also has a standard bounty, but only has 7 big blinds. So we cover one, but are covered by the other. This is where we should be reasonably tight. But one good way to think about it is that the small blind just doesn't matter. If we jam and he calls, that's fine. He's calling like 7 blinds and his bounty is worth like 2.5. So whatever. We don't care about that. We only care about the big blind. So we can treat this spot as if it was a blind versus blind spot. In terms of our jamming range, I'm not saying to start limping like Jack 4 off. Our range looks like this. Any ace, pocket pairs, suited aces, suited broadways, offsuit broadways. I think this can be a mistake a lot of people make, that they end up jamming too tight here. But because we don't care about the small blind, we can actually go fairly wide. If the small blind had a big stack himself and we were covered, then we would definitely be jamming way tighter than this. Now, if this was a non-PSKO tournament, then again, our jamming frequency would go up because our opponents wouldn't be incentivized to call us. So we go from jamming 19% to jamming 23%. And if we look at what the big blind calls in this situation, so in the PSKO, the big blind is calling 21.3%. So deuces, suited broadways, offsuit broadways, ace-5 off. But in the non-PSKO, the big blind is calling only 15%. So from 21 down to 15. And this again shows that even though risk premium for us is higher in the PSKO tournament, so making the in the non-PSKO tournament and making the money is more important in the non-PSKO, because of our reduced fold equity, we play tighter in the PSKO. And with that, we can move on to the third chapter, which is Final Table ICM. This hand will only be from the 5k starting stack tournament. So first, we have this hand over here, which is 4 players left, 5k starting stack. And if you assume the cutoff is opening 25%, how wide do we get to jam? Firstly, we need to care about is our bounty. We have 27 starting bounties, which is worth about 60k. So we can take the starting bounty as like 2.2k at this point. So yeah, around 60k or 1.5 big blinds. This is very common in big field tournaments, that when we reach such deep stages, the bounties are sort of irrelevant. So 25% from the cutoff is fairly tight, and we have reduced fold equity because of our bounty and because of the lower risk premium of PSKOs. So we actually need to be very tight here. Let me show you. You can see sixes are break even, king jack suited, we jam, and then ace 10 suited, ace jack off. So we're folding fives, we're folding king queen off, ace 10 off, ace 9 suited, ace 8 suited. These hands would be fist pump jumps in non-PSKO tournaments, but here we just don't get enough folds. The cutoff is actually supposed to call fairly tight himself, folding ace 9 suited, folding like king queen off, fives. I think in reality we will probably get called a bit wider, so we should be even more careful with our jams. The second part of the question is, if the cutoff had folded, and so actually was folded to us, how wide would we be jamming from the bottom for this 15 big blind stack size? And again, the answer is not too wide. Let me show you. So yeah, we're jamming about 9%, which is fours through nines, ace 9 off through ace king off, some good suited broadways, king queen off. Pocket threes just don't really make it. We also need to be very, very tight with our raises, and it's the same idea. We get called a bit too much here. We will be jamming more in a non-PSKO. The second question is this, we're seeing final table, but now we are 9 left. So 9 left, 5k starting stack. If we assume a 27% RFI, how wide should the big blind jump and how wide should we call? So what we need to pay attention to here is that the big blind bounty is actually non-existent. He has 2 starting bounties, which is worth here like 4k, which is like 1/5 of the big blind. A bit more than 4k, I guess. So yeah, maybe 1/4 of a big blind. Basically nothing. So because we open fairly wide, due to the other stacks behind, he actually gets to play fairly aggressive against us. He gets to exploit the fact that, well, not exploit, but take advantage of the fact that his bounty is non-existent. So let me show you. We open 27, and the big blind gets to play like this. So jam some ace-2 swap, ace-3 off, ace-2 suited, ace-3 suited. And this also assumes a fairly wide calling range for us, which is 8s, 9s, some ace-queen suited, and so on. I think it is a natural reaction for people to fold a bit more here against the non-existent bounty. So I also run this with a bit of a locked range, where against the jam, 9s and 8s were folding. Basically, this is the only change, right? Just folding 9s and 8s, which were a frequency call to begin with, which I think is a natural thing to expect to happen. So with this slight change, the big blind is actually jamming 25%. So any ace, almost any king, any suited ace, king, queen. And I think this is closer to the range we should be playing in game. When we're up against a wide range and our bounty is non-existent, we can take advantage of this fact and just be very, very aggressive. Next spot we have is this one. Same final table, 9 left, 5k starting stack. How wide does the button jam here? And how wide do we get to call and rejam from the small blind? So again, we want to look at the bounty first. His bounty is 20 starting bounties, which is like 44k or 2.5 big blinds. So he jams 10 and his bounty is worth 2.5. So we get to call fairly wide here. First, how wide does he jam? So because his fold equity is very minimal, he actually gets to jam very wide and linearly for value. We can see he jams 25.6%. So almost any pocket pair, any ace, any Broadway, king 9 suited. Now, against this jam, the small blind gets to play mainly calls. You can see we have very few jams with like 8s, 9s, like suited, good Broadways, ace 10, ace jack suited, ace queen off. And these are just some very strong hands which cannot overcall if we call and the big blind ends up jamming after we call. When we jam from the small blind against the button jam, the big blind calls 9s, ace queen suited. Yeah, seems reasonable. And if we call the button jam, the big blind is playing like this. So a good takeaway here would be that when the button is by far the shortest stack on the table and his bounty is somewhat significant, he just gets to jam very wide and a very high card heavy range, like no suited connected stuff. You can see 10-9 suited just folds. And that's because the big blind is calling like 42.6%. So the button will get called a very high percentage of the time here. The next question that we have is this blind versus blind spot. Same final table, 7 left, 5k starting stack. And the question is, how wide should we be jamming in this spot? Again, we need to figure out the big blind's bounty. His bounty is worth 42-ish, around 42 started bounties, which is maybe close to 90k chips or 3 big blinds. So not too much, but not nothing either. And again, we can see that the top bounties work really not much on large field final tables. Does he have a lot of ICM pressure? Well, not really, because there aren't that many super short stacks here. So this is how we get to play. So we can see very few jams, just some low pocket pairs and good suited connected stuff, some ace swap, but almost no jams. Instead, we get to play a very raise-heavy range. When we do jam, our opponent is supposed to call very wide. As we know, PKO premium is super low, and if he doubles up here, then he becomes the chip leader. So definitely some future EV for him. Against our raise, he gets to play like this, so defend super wide, and yeah, jam pocket pairs and some offsuit ace-x. Again, reminder, risk premium is low, so he gets to defend a lot against our open. The next spot is also blind versus blind, but now it is reversed. So we are 4 left, 5k starting stack. The question is, how wide can we jam in this spot when we are covered by the chip leader? Our boundary is the same as it was in the 3 spot, 27 starting bounties, which is worth about 1.5 big blinds. So not much. Here, this isn't a spot where we want to be jamming too much. We will have some jumps, yes, but we want to play a very call-heavy range. And here it is. So we have almost no all-in raises, and we're only jamming 11%. So offsuit ace-x, low pocket pairs. These kind of broadways benefited from limping and going post-flop against our opponent's dominated hands. When we jam, opponent is calling any pair, suited broadways. Yeah, I think maybe we see a bit of a wider calling range in reality. And if we limp in position plays like this. So very few jams and a fairly wide ISO range. Now, one thing that happens here is if we expect our opponent to be jamming a lot more against our limp, which I think is reasonable, when they have this big chip building stack, I think they attack limps a lot and they end up jamming more than they should. So if they start jamming a lot of these ace-x or more broadways, hands like that, then what happens is that we end up adding a lot of our limps into the jams. So if we look at the EVs of jamming, a lot of them will be profitable. Hands like king queen off, king jack off, these hands are king 10 off even, very profitable jams. Calling is more profitable, yes, but jamming still makes a lot of money. So once the equilibrium shifts and he starts jamming more against our limp, so we don't realize as much equity, then a lot of these hands want to go into the jamming range instead. So when we face this kind of spots, we need to be aware of how our opponent plays. And we also need to keep in mind that very often, the fact that one hand goes for one decision doesn't mean that the other one is a punt. It just means that it's slightly less good. So once our opponent's reaction make us strafe away from one option, then the other option will become better. So a lot of these hands should just be jamming in reality when our opponent attacks our limp more. And then the final hand that we have is this one here. So same final table, 9 left, 5k starting stack. And the question is, how wide can we be raising from the low jack? And how wide should the button be calling? Our bounty is the same. Looks like we didn't get any bounties this final table. So 27, so around 3 big blinds here, around 60k as we said. And our range here should be reasonably wide. We cover a bunch of people behind. Yes, we're out of position to the button, but still. So we get to open 24% as the low jack. You see, we're only covered by the button. So yeah, no real reason for us to be tight. Now, how does the button play against our open? Well, our bounty is worth 3 big blinds, so not too much, but not nothing. And as we know, the big stacks want to play a very call-heavy strategy. So his range looks like this. A lot of calling with suited hands, even 9-6 suited. You can see even like some queen-3 suited kind of hands. 5-3, 6-4, 4-3 suited. A very, very wide calling range and not much 3-betting. For 3-bet, he has his value, jacks through aces and ace-king. And then the bluffs, which are mostly offsuit ace-x. We've seen this before in PSKOs. We don't want to be 3-betting strong suited hands like suited aces as much. We'd rather use the offsuit ones. So basically, we 3-bet the best hands that we can profitably call. And you can see this very clearly, like these offsuit ace-x, king 9 off, like queen 2 suited, queen 5 suited. These are the hands that can't really call, so they instead go into the 3-bet range. After the button 3-bets, this is our response. So not much calling, but not zero. Calling good suited hands and some like 9s, 8s, and jamming jacks through kings, ace-king, ace-queen, and 4-betting with aces, ace-king suited, and some ace-jack off kind of hand. Some ace-5 suited as well. All right, and this wraps up the PSKO quiz. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you did well. See you on the next chapter.